There's a pattern in history that has wiped out three global superpowers over the last 500 years. And right now, in 2025, the United States is walking straight down that same path, step by step, choice by choice, almost as if we're following the very same script that led to disaster every single time before. In 1590, Spain was the wealthiest empire on earth. It controlled roughly half of the world's gold and silver. Its military dominated Europe. Its currency was accepted everywhere. And yet, within just 80 years, Spain was bankrupt, reduced to a second-rate power that never truly recovered. In 1914, Britain ruled the largest empire in human history. The sun literally never set on British territory. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. Within 40 years, the empire was gone. The currency collapsed. Britain became America's junior partner. In 1991, the Soviet Union stood as the other global superpower. Nuclear weapons, worldwide influence, satellites spanning the planet. Then it disappeared in just 900 days. Not because of war, but because its economy imploded from within. 3 times, 3 superpowers, 3 total collapses, and every single one followed the exact same sequence. Here's the part that should genuinely scare you. The United States has already passed 5 of the 7 stages. We're not approaching this pattern. We're already deep inside it. This is the story of how empires die, why they always convince themselves they're different, and why the numbers say we're next. And it's unfolding faster than most people are willing to admit. Before we walk through the pattern itself, you need to understand what imperial collapse actually looks like. Not the textbook version, but how it plays out in real life. What it really means when a superpower falls apart. Imperial collapse doesn't begin with an invasion or a crushing military defeat. It starts with economic exhaustion. The empire stretches itself beyond its ability to sustain what it has built. Military bases in 150 countries, conflicts on multiple fronts, promises it can't honor, debts it can't realistically repay. At first, the decline is almost impossible to see. The currency still functions, the military still wins battles, the government keeps making promises. But beneath the surface, the foundation is already breaking. Resources are misused, productive capacity shrinks. The most talented people leave or disengage. Then comes acceleration. Allies begin to hedge their bets. Enemies push boundaries. Trade partners look for alternatives. Reserve currency status slowly erodes. And suddenly, the very advantages that once made the empire powerful turn into liabilities. A currency that was once demanded by the entire world comes rushing back home. A military stretched across the globe becomes too expensive to sustain. Promises that were once backed by real strength turn into empty words. This isn't theory. This is exactly what happened to Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. And it happened because they made the same choices the United States is making right now. They believed their power was permanent, they overextended militarily, they debased their currency, and they refused to face reality until the collapse was already in motion. Let's look at how this unfolded 3 separate times, in almost the exact same way. We'll start with the first true global empire, Spain, from the 1500s to the 1600s. This is the original blueprint. After Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, Spain became the world's first true superpower. They conquered the Aztec and Inca empires and took control of the richest gold and silver mines ever discovered. By 1550, Spanish galleons were hauling home roughly 200 tons of silver every year. By 1600, that number had climbed to more than 400 tons annually. Spain effectively controlled Europe's money supply. The Spanish real became the global reserve currency. Everyone wanted Spanish silver. And this is where the pattern really begins. A nation that controls the world's money and convinces itself that this makes it untouchable. King Philip II, who ruled from 1556 to 1598, had access to more wealth than any monarch in history, and he spent it building and defending an empire. Stage 1 was military overextension. Spain fought wars everywhere at the same time, against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, against France and Italy, against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, against England's navy, plus wars in the Philippines and wars across the Americas. By 1580, Spain had military commitments on 4 different continents. The cost was enormous. Roughly half of Spain's entire revenue went straight to the military, and even that wasn't enough to sustain it all. Stage 2 was currency debasement. The Spanish crown couldn't cover its expenses through taxes alone, so they did what struggling empires have always done. They weakened their currency. They began mixing copper into silver coins. A coin that was supposed to be pure silver became 50% copper, then 75% copper. The face value stayed the same, but the real value collapsed. By 1600, Spanish silver coins barely contained any silver at all. Merchants stopped accepting them at full value. Inflation spiraled out of control. Stage 3 was the debt spiral. Spain borrowed relentlessly from Italian bankers, German bankers, and anyone else willing to lend. By 1557, less than 20 years into King Philip's reign, Spain declared bankruptcy. They defaulted, restructured their debt, and then kept borrowing. They declared bankruptcy again in 1560, again in 1575, and again in 1596. 4 bankruptcies in just 40 years. Each time they promised reform. Each time they returned to the same cycle of borrowing and spending. Stage 4 was the loss of productive capacity. This is the part of Spain's collapse that most people misunderstand. They had access to enormous amounts of gold and silver, and that wealth ended up destroying them. When money feels unlimited, production stops. Why grow food when you can import it? Why build ships when you can buy them? Why innovate when you can simply spend? Spanish nobility viewed labor as beneath them. Manufacturing declined. Agriculture stagnated. Wealth flowed outward to pay for French wine, Italian silk, and Dutch goods. The gold and silver pouring in from the Americas went right back out of the country. Spain became a pass-through. Money moved through them, but none of it stayed. By 1600, Spain produced almost nothing of its own. They were completely dependent on imports and entirely reliant on silver to pay for everything. When silver production slowed and the mines began to decline, the entire system collapsed. Stage 5 was social decay. As the economy failed, crime surged. Beggars filled the streets of Madrid. Productive citizens left the country. The brightest minds migrated to France, England, and the Netherlands, places that were building, creating, and expanding. Spain was left with bureaucrats, soldiers, and priests. No one was creating wealth anymore. Everyone was consuming it. By 1640, Spain lost Portugal. By 1650, they lost the Netherlands, their richest territory. By 1700, the Spanish Empire was little more than a shell. It still looked large on maps, but economically it was dead. Spain went from global superpower to secondary power in less than a century, and it never recovered. Today, Spain is a regional European country, beautiful, cultured, and pleasant, but largely irrelevant on the global stage. The descendants of the conquistadors now live in a tourist destination. That is what imperial collapse looks like. Now jump forward 300 years to Britain in the 1900s, the empire where the sun never set. At its peak, Britain controlled 25% of the world's land surface and ruled over 400 million people. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Major trade contracts were written in pounds. Central banks held British bonds. London was the financial centre of the world. And just like Spain centuries earlier, Britain believed this position was permanent. But the same pattern had already begun. Stage 1 was military overextension. By 1900, Britain had military commitments across the globe: India, Africa, the Middle East, China, the Pacific, the Caribbean. They were defending territory on 6 continents. The cost was massive. When World War I began in 1914, Britain faced a critical decision: stay neutral and let Europe tear itself apart, or enter the war and risk bankrupting the empire. They chose to fight. World War I cost Britain more than $40 billion, roughly $1 trillion in today's terms. They borrowed heavily, mostly from the United States. By 1918, Britain owed America billions. The world's leading creditor had become a debtor. But they had won the war. The empire remained. They believed they could rebuild. They were wrong. Stage 2 was currency debasement. The pound sterling was meant to be backed by gold. But the war had drained Britain's gold reserves. Gold had been shipped to America to pay for weapons, food, and supplies. By 1920, Britain's gold reserves were only half of what they had been in 1914. Even so, they tried to preserve the pound's old value. In 1925, Britain returned to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. The problem was simple: the pound was now overvalued. British exports became too expensive. Manufacturing declined. Unemployment rose. To defend the currency, the government kept interest rates high, which crushed the domestic economy. By 1931, they couldn't sustain it any longer. Britain abandoned the gold standard. The pound immediately lost 25% of its value. The global reserve currency had just admitted it could no longer keep its promises. Stage 3 was the debt spiral. Britain never truly recovered from its World War I debt, and then World War II arrived. Another $120 billion in costs. More borrowing from the United States. By 1945, Britain owed the US and Canada more than $30 billion, an amount greater than Britain's entire GDP at the time. The war was won, but the empire was finished. They could no longer defend it. They couldn't afford it. They couldn't maintain it. Stage 4 was the loss of empire. In 1947, Britain gave up India, the crown jewel of the empire and the primary source of its wealth, for nearly 200 years. Over the next 2 decades, everything else followed: Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean. By 1970, the British Empire existed only in history books. Stage 5 was currency collapse. The pound kept falling. In 1940, £1 was worth $4.03. By 1950, it was $2.80. By 1970, $2.40. By 1980, around $1.30. Today, it hovers near $1.27. The world's reserve currency had become a regional one. Britain tried to maintain appearances: a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, nuclear weapons, a special relationship with the United States. But the reality was obvious. They were a former power, a museum of past greatness. The empire was gone, and it never returned. Now consider the most recent example, the Soviet Union, from 1945 to 1991. After World War II, the USSR emerged as a superpower. Nuclear weapons, a massive military, control over Eastern Europe, satellites in space. They believed they represented the future. Communism would bury capitalism. The Soviet system would dominate the world. For 45 years, they competed directly with the United States. They matched American military strength, built more tanks, more missiles, more troops. But beneath the surface, the economy was slowly dying. Stage 1 was military overextension. The Soviet Union spent between 15 and 20% of its GDP on the military, roughly 3 times what the United States spent. They tried to match American technology, American global reach, and American alliances, but their economy was far smaller. They were fighting in Afghanistan, propping up Cuba, supporting Syria, Vietnam, North Korea, Angola, and Ethiopia. The costs kept rising, and the system beneath it all was already breaking. Everywhere America had influence, the Soviets felt they had to counter it. Every proxy, every alliance, every move. The cost of that constant competition was unsustainable. Stage 2 was economic stagnation. The Soviet economy stopped growing in the 1970s. Oil revenues kept things afloat for a while, but almost nothing else functioned properly. Factories churned out low-quality goods no one wanted. Farms failed to meet basic needs. Technology lagged decades behind the West. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was importing grain. Think about that for a moment. A country with some of the most fertile farmland on Earth couldn't feed its own population. Why? Because central planning doesn't work. Because innovation dies under rigid control. Because people don't produce when there's no incentive to do better. Stage 3 was currency collapse. The ruble was never a real currency in any global sense. It couldn't be freely exchanged internationally. Even Soviet citizens didn't trust it. When they could, they used US dollars instead. The government had to buy foreign goods using gold and oil because no one wanted rubles. Then, in 1985, oil prices collapsed. Soviet gold reserves started running dry. They were running out of real money. Stage 4 was the loss of empire. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Eastern Europe broke away almost overnight. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, East Germany gone within a single year. The satellite states that gave the Soviet Union strategic depth and influence simply disappeared. And the Soviet government couldn't stop it. They were broke. Stage 5 was total collapse. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. Just 900 days from the fall of the Berlin Wall to complete dissolution. No invasion, no world war, just economic implosion. The military couldn't be paid. The government stopped functioning. The ruble became worthless. A superpower with 30,000 nuclear weapons collapsed from internal economic failure. The pattern played out again. Overextension. Currency failure. Debt. Loss of empire. Collapse. And here's the part that should keep you awake at night. The United States is following the exact same pattern, stage by stage. Let's start with military overextension. The United States operates more than 750 military bases across roughly 80 countries. We have troops deployed in about 150 countries. We're committed to defending Europe through NATO, defending Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, fighting ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, countering China, countering Russia. Our annual military budget is around $850 billion, more than the next 10 countries combined. And even that isn't enough. We're stretched thin, equipment is aging, recruitment numbers are falling, and our commitments exceed our actual capacity. If China moves on Taiwan, if Russia pushes deeper into NATO territory, if Iran disrupts the Persian Gulf, we don't have the ability to respond to all of it at once. We're overextended. Just like Spain, just like Britain, just like the Soviet Union. Stage 2 is currency debasement. In 1971, Nixon closed the gold window and ended the dollar's direct link to gold. The dollar became a pure fiat currency. Since 2000, the US money supply has increased by roughly 400%. Since 2020 alone, more than $6 trillion have been created. The dollar has lost about 98% of its purchasing power since 1971. We're not mixing copper into silver coins anymore. We're just printing unlimited paper and digits. The method is different, but the outcome is the same. Debasement. Stage 3 is the debt spiral. The United States now owes about $36 trillion, roughly 120% of GDP. Interest payments alone are nearing $1 trillion per year. We're spending more on interest than on national defense. We run massive deficits every single year. In 2024, nearly $1.8 trillion, during a growing economy and in peacetime. We're borrowing money just to pay interest on previous borrowing. That is the textbook definition of a debt spiral. Spain defaulted repeatedly. Britain borrowed until it collapsed. The Soviet Union simply ran out of money. We're on the same road. Stage 4 is the loss of productive capacity. America doesn't really make things anymore. We design, we finance, we consume, but we don't produce at scale. Our manufacturing base has been hollowed out and shipped overseas to China, Mexico, Vietnam, and elsewhere. We import about $800 billion more than we export every year. We're dependent on foreign supply chains for critical goods, medicine, electronics, steel, even components used by our own military. Just as Spain became dependent on imports while its silver flowed out, we've become dependent on imports while dollars flow out. And just like Spain, when the money stops flowing, the weakness becomes impossible to ignore. Stage 5 is social decay. Trust in institutions is at historic lows. Crime is rising in many cities. Homelessness is growing rapidly. Drug overdoses kill around 100,000 Americans every year. The most capable and ambitious people are either leaving, disengaging, or opting out entirely. Fertility rates are collapsing. Political dysfunction is absolute. We can't agree on basic facts, let alone solutions. The system feels frozen, angry, and exhausted. Can't fix anything, can't build anything, we're stuck. The signs of decay are everywhere, yet everyone keeps pretending everything is fine. It's not fine. Check. We're already at stage 5 out of 7. The Soviet Union reached stage 5 before it completely collapsed. Britain did too. Spain lasted longer, but the pattern never changed. We're not at the very end yet, but we're deep into the sequence. Stage 6 is the loss of reserve currency status. That's when allies begin to diversify, when global trade starts shifting into other currencies, when dollars flood back home because the rest of the world no longer needs to hold them. And we're already seeing the early warning signs. BRICS nations are building alternatives. Central banks are buying gold at record levels. China and Russia are trading in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia is accepting yuan for oil. The cracks are forming right now. Stage 7 is collapse. Not a slow, gentle decline, but a sudden implosion. The Soviet Union went from superpower to non-existent in just 900 days. Britain lost its empire in about 20 years. Spain took longer, but the outcome was identical. When the reserve currency fails, when debt becomes unmanageable, when the military can no longer be funded, empires don't fade away quietly. They collapse fast and brutally. And everyone who believed it could never happen here learns the same lesson every empire eventually learns. It can, and it does. 3 empires followed this exact pattern. Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union. Each one believed they were exceptional. Each one believed they were different. Each one believed the rules didn't apply to them. And every single time they were wrong. Now we're telling ourselves the same story. We're different. We have better technology. We have the dollar. We're America. But the pattern doesn't care about exceptionalism. The pattern is mathematical. You cannot spend beyond your means forever. You cannot maintain an empire without real productive capacity. You cannot debase your currency without consequences. And once you've completed stages 1 through 5, you cannot simply skip stages 6 and 7. The sequence locks in. The only variable left is timing. Maybe we have 10 years, maybe 5, maybe less. But the pattern says collapse is coming. And when it arrives, it won't be slow, it will be sudden. A currency crisis that triggers a debt crisis, which triggers a political crisis.